Welcome to a new episode of InFocus with Ejaz Haider. In the world of news and headlines, the biggest story gets the traction. Even the idea of what is big is decided by what the readers and viewers want to read and watch. So it's not surprising that a significant development flew under the radar while the world remained fixated on the illegal war thrust on Iran by the US and the Zionist entity. That development was the third consecutive collapse of the NPT review conference. But before I get to our present purpose, a word about this program. It is sponsored by the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. CESPA is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and its menu consists of issues that make up contemporary security and strategic development. But let's get back to the RevCon collapse. The issue is simple. A final consensus document needs unanimity. Every state signing off on it. Even a single outlier can derail the process over specific technical or regional disputes. The 2015 conference derailed over the technical implementation of a Middle East weapons of mass destruction free zone. Arab states demanded a binding timeline. The US and UK threw the hat in the ring to protect the Zionist entity from diplomatic isolation. The 2020 conference was pushed to 2022 because of COVID-19. Sticking point by then had shifted to civilian nuclear safety. Russia vetoed the text, predictably, because the text expressed grave concern over military activities surrounding the Russian-occupied Zaporizhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine. This time around, the gridlock deepened over safeguards, compliance, and emerging technology. A final draft line stating that Iran can never seek, develop, or acquire any nuclear weapons became the primary trigger. In fact, I would say it was the trigger. Iran fiercely rejected this, demanding that the text must condemn US Zionist strikes on its domestic nuclear sites. The US blocked this, accusing Iran of contempt for barring IAEA inspectors. Concurrently, non-nuclear weapon states demanded strict, measurable benchmarks to track arsenal modernization, which nuclear weapon states rejected. Finally, delegations could not agree on how to classify or regulate the integration of artificial intelligence into nuclear command and control networks. So these combined disputes paralyzed the consensus process. Result, collapse. The fact is that the strategic architecture that regulated global nuclear arsenals for decades has already collapsed. For whatever Article 6 was worth, and we don't have time to get into what it meant and where it was binding or non-binding or a quid for the Non-Proliferation Co., disarmament is done and dusted. Heck, arms control itself is headed to ER. Ironic, because for years, nuclear weapon states brushed off criticism regarding the lack of genuine disarmament by pointing to bilateral arms control treaties, primarily between the US and Russia, as proof that they were curbing vertical proliferation. That's passé. The unraveling began with the US withdrawal from the ABM treaty in 2002, followed by the death of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2019, amidst allegations by the US of Russian cheating. The Open Skies Treaty fell next. The final blow came when Russia suspended its participation in New START, the last remaining treaty capping the superpowers' deployed strategic arsenals. With New START set to expire, there are no legal limits on the world's two largest nuclear stockpiles. And I'm not even talking about China, whose stockpile is the fastest growing, by the way. It's not even part of this arrangement. So this vacuum is dangerously amplified by emerging technologies, hypersonic weapons, artificial intelligence, and cyber warfare compress decision-making time and raise the risk of accidental escalation. The modern battlefield also suffers from dangerous entanglement. Conventional and nuclear systems share command, control, and early warning networks. A strike intended to disable conventional assets could be misinterpreted as a prelude to a nuclear first strike in case of a conflict between a nuclear dyad. And all this is happening when the current US president has overtly declared in a January 2026 interview with the New York Times that he didn't need international law, that he is constrained only by his own morality and his own mind. Not my words, these are his words. It doesn't require much argument to appreciate that this personalized doctrine has profound structural implications for global stability, weapons regimes, and international law itself. To try to figure out the wolf world we've entered, I have a rather dream panel. Dr. William Porter is Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar Professor of Non-Proliferation Studies and founding director of the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies at MIIS. He's the author, co-author, or editor of over 20 books. He has participated as a delegate at every NPT review conference and preparatory committee meeting since 1995. Dr. Mark Goodman is a former senior scientist at the US State Department who specialized in nuclear policy for 30 years and took part in multiple NPT review conferences. He's a non-resident fellow at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. Last but certainly not least, his friend Dr. Tariq Rauf. He's an internationally respected authority on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation issues. He was senior advisor to the chair of the Disarmament Committee at the 2015 Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. From 2002 to 2011, he was head of the Verification and Security Policy Coordination Office at the International Atomic Energy Agency, where he reported directly to the Director General. From 1987 to 2000, he was expert advisor to Canada's NPT delegations. So welcome to the program, gentlemen. It's great to have all of you here. And as I said, it's a dream panel. I don't think I could possibly, and I have to actually thank Ali Jafri for this, to get this kind of expertise in one program. So let me begin with Dr. Porter. I've already commiserated with you and also with Dr. Goodman and certainly with Tariq Rauf also, because you guys have actually seen how the things have deteriorated. So is this, and I'm not talking about the form because form can stay for a very long time, but I'm talking about substance, third consecutive collapse, and a number of other developments to go with that. Should we requiescat in pace NPT, or is there still some hope?
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much first for the opportunity to speak and to join my very experienced colleagues in this discussion. I think the first point that I would make, having been to all of these different review conferences and prep comms, sometimes I ask myself, was it worth it to spend over a year in these stuffy rooms, hearing kind of stale points raised over and over and over again. But the first point I would nonetheless say, based upon my experience, is that regardless of the international situation, it's never been easy to forge a consensus outcome. That goes back to '95, and in fact, as both I think Mark and Tariq were there as well. What we got was really 3 decisions and a resolution, but we didn't get any consensus in terms of the review of the prior 5 years, and that was a decision taken by the president. So there's just so much traffic that the treaty can bear, and that's the case when you get consensus agreements and when you don't. One point I would just flag here, though, in terms of your kind of teeing up the discussion, there's no requirement that the decision has to be by consensus. The rules of procedure allow for voting on both substantive and procedural matters. There was very significant discussion before the 1995 NPT Review and Extension Conference about voting. And in fact, Mr. Rauf was very much involved in doing the counting that made it possible for the president to declare that there was support for the indefinite extension without a vote. So there's been this tradition of consensus, which has enabled one or two countries to block consensus. But in principle, that need not be a game stopper. Uh, I mention all of this because I think it would have been unrealistic to have assumed, given the state of the world today, that approximately 150 countries who participated in the review conference could reach consensus on any meaningful document. And there were lots of other issues that, unless you were in the room listening to the interventions on each of the chairs' different draft outcome documents, that for the most part were just removed from the final text, which caused a lot of disagreement. But there was overwhelming support for most of them. A good example, you mentioned artificial intelligence. There was one country, basically Russia, that insisted that that item be removed from the text. There was strong support among both other nuclear weapon states, but in particular, many of the leading non-nuclear weapon states on that point. So the very astute president, and I want to give him exceptional credit for a number of innovations that he introduced, and we can talk more about that if you want. But he chose, in an effort to find a document that might, in fact, win support, to remove most of the contentious issues. I mean, any reference to North Korea, there was very, very strong support for including that in the text, that was removed. There was very strong support for emphasizing the grave nature of the threats that the treaty faced and the need for urgent action. And those modifiers were also either removed or toned down, very greatly. So I wouldn't focus, exclusively on the one bracketed portion of the text, which at the end of the day was the item where consensus couldn't be reached, because there were a lot of countries that were very, very upset with what had been removed from the treaty and also what was not in the treaty. So I would simply note in response to your kind of asking a question, I think it remains the case that the overwhelming majority of states who are party to the treaty continued to believe that it serves their national security interests. Some of them attach more importance to disarmament issues, others to non-proliferation. There tends to be probably the greatest convergence of views with respect to the importance of peaceful use. And so the treaty, I think, remains useful. But what is disturbing is, and again, your other panelists, I think, can comment on this as well, is that headway that one might have noted, at least through 2010, in terms of trying to establish some benchmarks for progress in these different sectors, and particularly with respect to disarmament, has been rolled back. So I would say the text that was presented as the last revised text of the president represented in many respects a regression from what had been possible in the past. But I wouldn't interpret the third consecutive failure to reach a consensus document as suggesting that the treaty no longer is highly valued by many parties.
Right. Well, he withdrew the text. He didn't even put it to a vote. So I mean, clearly there were. I mean, you were there. I wasn't there, and I frankly don't really want to get into the minutiae of things because those are very technical things. This program is for informed journalists, which includes myself, frankly. I want to kind of juxtapose the issue with various other developments and go to Dr. Goodman. So when the treaty was negotiated, there were, quid pro quos. The have-nots were also, frankly, interested in many ways and for various reasons in having something which was a kind of stepping stone towards maybe at some point disarmament, which obviously never happened, but that's a separate debate. But what we are witnessing now, and those things don't really have to do with the NPT per se, but they certainly have a deleterious impact on the treaty to do with conversations that are happening now in places as, like South Korea, Japan, Germany, about getting nuclear weapons capability. We have the issue of Iran, which instead of being litigated in and through the treaty is being litigated on the battlefield. Which, ironically enough, if I were an Iranian, would have forced me to maybe think about actually getting the nuclear weapons. So I want you to focus on where you think the situation is headed and situate the NPT and the collapse of the REVCON in the broader context in which the geopolitical configuration is reshaping.
Well, thank you. I'm also honored to be part of this, especially with Tariq and Bill, who have among the few people I know who have been involved with this process longer than I have. I want to first go back a little bit to what you said before and just make a few key points. I think there's a mistaken logic that ties the success of the NPT to the outcome of NPT review conferences. The NPT is a treaty with binding provisions on non-proliferation and safeguards and peaceful use and relatively vague but binding provisions on disarmament. And that remains in force. The review conference has always been an iffy matter. Fewer than half have reached consensus. Now, the last three have been unable to reach consensus. And that's not a good trend. It's a signal of division in the disarmament politics, international disarmament politics. But as Bill pointed out, it's not a signal of loss of confidence in the NPT and the broader regime of which it is a part. I also want to respond to some of your earlier remarks. You listed a large set of issues that were responsible for maybe the lack of consensus. As far as I'm aware, maybe Bill can correct me from his conversations, the only issue on which there was a lack of consensus in the end was whether or not to name Iran in that one paragraph that was in brackets.
That was the trigger.
I've never heard any other delegation say that they would have opposed it for any other reason than that. So that brings me to the question of how the NPT process is supposed to deal with issues like Iran. And it's always been a difficult matter. In the olden days, when I started, it was unusual for a review conference to focus on individual country issues. The purpose of the conference was to look at the global regime and the system. Now, of course, individual country issues always came up, beginning, well, in my experience with Iraq and North Korea in the 1990s, which led to then significant efforts to strengthen the non-proliferation system. And then more recently, there's been non-compliance with Syria and Iran over the last 20 plus years. But the response of the review conference has been to look at ways to strengthen the system. The thing that I see eroding in recent years is the willingness to try to adjudicate these regional issues in a setting that was never designed to deal with them. The way the NPT deals with these issues is through compliance verification at the IAEA and enforcement mechanisms at the UN Security Council and other diplomatic activities. I think, unfortunate, there's been an increasing tendency to use military action, as we've seen recently, but it's not a new thing. The first military attack on a nuclear program was, I think, in 1981 when Israel attacked Iraq's nuclear reactor. But back to the question of the status of the bargain of the NPT, which is, I think, what you were getting at. I think the bargain is still pretty strong. And I think that a lot of the talk about states rethinking their commitments to the NPT is a bit overstated. That's not to say we shouldn't be worried. I think the prospect of Iran withdrawing from the NPT or of South Korea, I think among the nuclear weapon states allies, that's probably the one where there's the largest element of public pressure on acquiring nuclear weapons. Those would be bad things. But I also think there remain a lot of connections and conditions in the international system that discourage that kind of development. It's interesting that Iran has, in the past, threatened to withdraw from the NPT, or some Iranian officials have suggested that Iran should, if certain things happened, and then that never came to pass. I think Iran so far has concluded that it is better off proclaiming its innocence, however dubious that claim is, within the system, than leaving the system and making clear that, or either making clear that its intentions were never benign, or at least raising much greater concerns about its intentions. And I think the alliance and economic partnership between the United States and South Korea, it has been battered and bruised, but I think it remains essentially intact and remains as a barrier to South Korea acquiring nuclear weapons. Among the other allies, I think within NATO, there's a very strong interest in maintaining the U.S. security guarantees that's embodied in the nuclear alliance and the nuclear umbrella, as it's called, the extended deterrence relationship, but not much interest in independently acquiring nuclear weapons. I think the states want assurance that the United States and France and the United Kingdom will support them, but not necessarily focused on acquiring nuclear weapons, but not particularly focused on acquiring nuclear weapons themselves. So in that sense, I think the concerns about defection from the regime are a bit overstated. They're worth paying attention to, but not treating as an impending disaster.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to hear that. Of course, I don't particularly share either yours or Dr. Porter's optimism, but I hope you're right, and I hope that I'm wrong. I need to pull in.
I'm rarely called an optimist, so I was trying to an even-handed assessment, but as Tariq knows in particular over the years, I've been more pessimistic than most. I'm just not sure that the scale has changed so dramatically as to be writing the death knell for the treaty.
Yeah, well, unraveling happens kind of slowly, and then suddenly it happens. But let's see, Dr. Rauf, how do you assess the collapse? Again, the question is not just the collapse in terms of technical minutiae or what happened at the conference, but also how things are unfolding within the larger ambit of geopolitical changes.
Well, thank you for inviting me to join this discussion, and I'm very pleased to be here with Bill and Mark, who've been astute observers and participants in the NPT review process for a long time. So as we discern from this discussion thus far, the Non-Proliferation Treaty does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in the context of broader international security developments in particular. And Ejaz, you listed a whole bunch of developments that were on the negative side. So all of those enter the room and they impact the discussions in the NPT forum. To pick up from one of the points that Mark was making, the Non-Proliferation Treaty review process is the only forum where the 5 nuclear weapon states are prepared to hold themselves accountable. It's the only forum where they will come and explain to whatever level each one of them is comfortable with what their nuclear weapons policies are. They are also now submitting reports on their nuclear weapons policies and holdings in different ways. Some are more transparent and detailed than others. They don't do that anywhere else. It's not done in Geneva at the Conference of Disarmament. It's certainly not done at the General Assembly. So there is a value in the NPT review process, whether or not we end up with an outcome document. Now, this treaty was made permanent in May of 1995. So there was an inbuilt mechanism in the treaty when it came into force in 1970 that the countries of proliferation concern at that time were the nuclear advanced countries, particularly in Western Europe and Japan. And while they were willing to sort of give up a nuclear weapons option under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, they certainly were not prepared to give up their option to use nuclear technology. And that's why enrichment and reprocessing is not prohibited. Also, they wanted to see how the nuclear weapon states would deliver on their obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So there was this clause built into the treaty that 25 years after entry into force, the states parties would decide on the future of the treaty, and it was decided that the best outcome would be indefinite extension, that the treaty is made permanent forever. But it came at a price. One was a strengthened review process, which lengthened the review process between each review conference. There was also a document on principles and objectives for non-proliferation and disarmament, and to bring the states of the Middle East to support this, who are very reluctant to support this extension without Israel being brought into the ambit of the treaty. We had the Middle East resolution, and you referred to that. So those basically are the benchmarks on which the review process has developed. And Mark has been writing, and his most recent writings in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has been arguing that the review process is broken. I am on the other side of that discussion, that it's not broken. And as Bill pointed out in his comments, the President, Ambassador Viet of Vietnam, introduced a number of innovations in the way the review conference was held, which didn't require formal pieces of paper. So we really don't need to fix the review process in a piece of paper that says statements should be 3 minutes or 5 minutes, and each chair should hand off to the next chair. We don't need to write this up. It's already there. The system is already flexible enough. But coming back to the substance, next year will be 25 years since the Iran nuclear file opened here in Vienna at the IAEA. The only people who have threatened in Iran to leave the NPT have been retired officials. To this date, no serving official at a sufficiently high level, Deputy Foreign Minister level, head of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, has threatened to leave the treaty. And this very morning, today, there was a meeting at the IAEA, an emergency meeting on the attacks at the Baraka nuclear power plant. And again, there was this discussion.
This is the UAE letter that they wrote, and which was supported by EJ Films. Yeah,
UAE
that's right.
is part of the board of governors, so the
Not a squeak about the attacks on Iranian nuclear facilities.
Yes, I was about to come to that. So the only countries that can call an extraordinary board meeting are those countries that are already on the board of governors. So that's why the UAE couldn't call for it. But you're right. But unfortunately, while the board of governors has condemned the Russian attacks and occupation of both the Chernobyl and the Zaporizhia nuclear power plants, the board of governors to this date has never condemned the attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities. There have never been a resolution. And also with regard to the non-compliance findings on Iran, we should be very clear. These refer to activities that took place in the early 2000s. Iran has not been found to be in non-compliance in the current. The Safeguards Implementation Report came out. It talks about declared material being accounted for. The latest report of the IAEA on the application of safeguards came out yesterday. And it says, except for the facilities that have been bombed, at the 13 other facilities, the IAEA can say that nuclear material is accounted for. far. But the big problem is, and I'm glad that this report very clearly says that because of the bombings in June and now, the IAEA has lost continuity of knowledge on the stocks of 440.9 kilograms of 60% and 184.1 kilograms of 20%. Now we need to ask the question, how do we know that there were 440.9 kilograms and not 550 and not 230? It's because IAEA inspectors were there on the ground. But if you carry out activities which undermine the safeguard system, so the last inspections at Isfahan, Natanz, and Fordo were between the 27th of May and the 11th of June last year. When did the bombing start? 12th of June. So this was a clear vote of no confidence in what the IAEA was reporting on nuclear material. So these are some of the deep fissures where international politics comes and overwhelms the non-proliferation. And to conclude, you already referred to it, that there is no discussions at the moment at any level between Moscow and Washington on the follow-on treaty to New START, which already expired in February. China is not willing to come to a multilateral forum. We have nuclear modernizations going on. But the non-proliferation treaty review process is not the mechanism to solve this. It's not the mechanism to negotiate New START. It's not the mechanism to negotiate a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty. It is to provide encouragement and the benchmarks and the context for the nuclear weapon states to go and negotiate these treaties and then to report to us.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, which then takes me to the issue of the nuclear weapon states. Let's assume that the have-nots are all there, part of the NPT, under the regime and the IAEA inspections and verification mechanism and the rest of it. But then there are the nuclear weapon states. 5 of them considered, quote unquote, recognized, but there are other states. There is India, there's my own country, Pakistan, North Korea, having withdrawn from the NPT, and of course, the other state, which has nuclear weapons, has never declared them, was helped by the French to develop that, deceived the Americans. You know, that correspondence between JFK and Ben Gurion is very interesting, and all of that. So one of the reasons the Middle Eastern countries, especially Egypt, was so interested, as you know very well, in declaring the Middle East as a nuclear weapons-free zone, which is where, as I said, the UK and US came to the help of the Zionist entity. So I want to now focus, going to Dr. Porter, on the issue of the recognized nuclear weapon states and also the quote-unquote unrecognized, as in outside the NPT nuclear weapon states, and the problem of emerging technologies. So for a moment, if we keep aside other issues and focus on arms control, that entire regime already seems to have unraveled. How does that impact, given other geopolitical developments, on even the have-nots who might be geographically situated in troubled neighborhoods?
So let me try to do so briefly and address both the last point that you made, but also the one dealing with disruptive technologies and AI as well. So I think one of the things that was, most disturbing to me, and although I participated on a delegation, I'm speaking very much in my personal capacity, and then talk about the AI dimension here. It was very disturbing for states who at some level recognize these tremendous challenges that we are confronting, including the destruction of the foundation of arms control as we've known it in the past, not to see a sense of urgency on the part of countries who were meeting for a month in New York to consider approaches to dealing with these problems that were commensurate with the challenges that we're facing. Everything was done by a few states in particular to water down the language of the treaty. Wherever grave was put in the context of either the need for urgent action to address grave challenges, it was other language was used, which conveyed a sense that the issues were not as pronounced, were not as urgent as, in fact, I think the overwhelming majority of states, and particularly the non-nuclear weapon states, believed to be the case. There wasn't adequate attention given to the urgency of addressing the problems of the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. The country that I was on, I mean, Austria, for example, took that particularly seriously. They've been a leader in that domain. So there was this disconnect, I think, that many people, myself included, observed between the very real challenges that we see in the world that we've been talking about to some extent, that you've been raising, and the reluctance to address these in a meaningful fashion. That is also the case with respect to AI. And so it was astonishing to me, and this is where I thought there actually might be the possibility of adding something that recognizes a new technological development that impacts directly on all states, north and south, nuclear, non-nuclear. NPT recognized nuclear weapon states and other nuclear weapons possessors, particularly as
Even let me, if I may add, just to corroborate what you're saying, that even the use of conventional weapon systems with the AI in the kill chain now is something that is being debated. So once you add the nuclear, weapons to the thing, then it becomes even more problematic.
right. So state after state, from all these different groupings, recognized at least the importance of addressing the role of AI and command and control issues, the so-called man in the loop issue. That seemed to enjoy consensus. My concern was that we only focused on that AI issue and not how it impacted upon nuclear safety, nuclear security, non-state actors. But there was a near consensus that exists, and then Russia insisted that that language be dropped. And there was a lot of negative reaction to that. One of the problems, and it's not, but it is most apparent in the NPT context, is that most of the participants in these meetings, they're professional diplomats. Many of them have legal training. They know very little about disruptive technologies and even less about AI. And so they've learned to talk the talk. They talk about the need for a man in the loop. They really don't understand the impact of these technologies, whether it's in the conventional sector, the nuclear sector. They simply don't have that understanding. And so I've been emphasizing the need. We have to bring in experts. We have to bring in parties that know something about this to help raise the level of discourse. But there's a reluctance to do that, a reluctance to do things, differently. So I think that's a major problem. And if we stick our heads, in the sand and don't recognize these extraordinarily important technological changes, it's going to be most unfortunate. The last point that I will make, it's very hard for me to be optimistic about many things, but the NPT does provide an opportunity, which is not always realized, for the 5 nuclear weapon states recognized by the NPT to interact, to have discussions, the so-called P5 or N5 process. That did not take place in 2022 at the penultimate review conference, but it did this time around. And so there were some discussions. And I must say, I was surprised that the atmosphere was not worse than it actually was. And so there were those interactions. I don't know if they're going to lead anywhere, I know the Chinese in particular attach great importance to the P5 process. So the forum there, I think, was useful, at least in that regard, but it's a very, very baby step that is not, again, commensurate with the major steps that need to be taken if we're going to try to rebuild in any fashion the arms control infrastructure that we had in the past, and to take meaningful steps in the nuclear risk reduction sphere.
Right. So, Dr. Goodman, when this treaty was being negotiated, and it was a very complex process. As a matter of fact, I think I've been fortunate enough to have come across this 3-volume study by Ambassador Ibrahim Shakar, which I think is pretty definitive when it comes to how this process unfolded. So I want you to give me a sense of how things might have changed from when this treaty was being negotiated, and which netted such a large number of states which agreed not to have nuclear weapons, to the point, and we have discussed various other things, but to the point where, for a number of reasons, the non-nuclear weapon states have decided that, they've almost abandoned the NPT-centric framework and actually went and negotiated a legally binding treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which, if I remember correctly, took effect in 2021. So I'm not saying that that is going to replace the NPT, but I'm just trying to make this point that there is a level of frustration with the working of the NPT, which seems to be taking root, and this 2021 legally binding treaty seems to be just one expression of that.
What they negotiated takes the form of a treaty, but it actually is more of the way I think of it, it's more of a political manifesto than a treaty. It establishes a review process, a form of engagement. It doesn't add very much to the obligations that most of its parties already had not to acquire nuclear weapons. It does add the obligation not to have them stationed on their territory. So in that way, it's like a nuclear weapon free zone treaty. But I think the main purpose was as kind of an escape valve for expressing discontent with the pace of
I think, without quibbling over whether it's because it is a legally binding treaty, or call it a political statement, but the fact, as you rightly said, the most important point is that there is frustration there. And I think that's an important point.
Yes, and there's frustration not just among the non-nuclear weapon states. I think as a participant in the U.S. delegation for many years, we had significant frustration, including internal frustration within the government. There are differences of opinion and emphasis within any government. But with the level of progress and the extent to which the changing security environment has made that progress more difficult. The fact that China now has roughly 5 times the number of nuclear weapons that it had at the time that it joined the treaty is something that I think is a significant impediment if you're trying to go in the opposite direction. And it didn't get much attention. I think China was very successful in deflecting criticism at this review conference. I think you also asked a question about the distinction between the recognized nuclear weapon states and the other states that possess nuclear weapons. For the most part, the NPT review process has focused on the recognized nuclear weapon states, the ones that tested before 1967 by the definition of the treaty. I think you're on mute now.
Yeah, I was merely making a distinction between the recognized nuclear weapon states under the NPT and those that now have the nuclear weapons but are not part of the NPT.
No, but I think that the review conference has sometimes been divided on the question for various ideological reasons of how to deal with these states that possess nuclear weapons. There's a strong inclination not to give them status by somehow recognizing the fact that they have nuclear weapons, including your own country. At the same time, I think there's an increasing recognition that progress towards, well, first of all, preserving the record of non-use of nuclear weapons and avoiding nuclear war, which is the very first preambular paragraph of the NPT as the objective, that requires some action or refraining from action by states that are not party to the treaty. It's hard for the review process to influence those states. They can talk about them, but they can't impose commitments upon them. But I do think there are things like the norm against nuclear testing and the norm against nuclear use. And I would have hoped the norm against production of fissile materials for weapons, but that norm doesn't really exist yet. That those kinds of things would be influential on states outside the treaty and would help to at least prevent the nuclear relationships around the world from getting worse, or help slow that down. So in that sense, I'm particularly concerned by statements by the Trump administration that they would resume nuclear testing on an equal basis. It's not quite clear what that means. And I was a little bit encouraged by the approach of the US delegation at the review conference, where they were open to preserving the objective of entry into force of the CTBT, provided that questions about whether Russia and China had conducted tests of a positive yield, non-zero yield, provided those questions could be resolved. So I thought the review conference had a little bit of a healthy effect in that sense. And I think Bill pointed to the fact that the P5 were able to talk to one another at the review conference and agree on some language. However disappointing that language turned out to be, it was a step. You know, I remember, I was just end with this anecdote. At the last NPT meeting that I attended in 2024, said that when the nuclear weapon states are united, they are formidable. When they're divided, they're absolutely immovable. So I think even though the nuclear weapon states tend to unite in resistance to pressure on disarmament, the fact that they're able to talk to one another is, I think, promising. The fact that they agreed on language, even though the document wasn't adopted, on continuing to engage on risk reduction with possible progress towards arms control discussions, I think that's constructive and hopeful. And the fact that France, as the incoming coordinator for the P5 weapon states process, said they would pursue that activity is promising. These aren't dramatic changes, but I think they are at least a little bit of an adjustment in a positive direction.
If I could just add one point before you turn to Tariq, you asked about significant changes since the treaty entered into force, and I think perhaps the most significant was that up until, I would say, 2018, the United States and the Soviet Union and then Russia had a common interest in strengthening the review conference. They worked together hand in hand, even for the first 3 weeks in 2015, which fell apart. That's absolutely missing today. And that has changed the dynamic among countries in the review process. So I just wanted to flag that
No. Thank you so much for that. You've actually beaten me to the punch on this, because this is how I was going to situate my question to Dr. Rauf, because this was one of those rare things, sort of cooperative approach at the height of the Cold War, which actually allowed this treaty to come into existence, and of course also after that, sort of looking at the entire system, the verification processes, and the rest of it, and which is why I was actually goading Dr. Goodman into acknowledging that. So thank you for bringing out that point. So, Dr.
Can I just comment quickly on that? I mean,
Sure.
I do think since Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine back in 2014, there has been an erosion of cooperation between the United States and Russia. I think it began in 2015, even though it wasn't as evident as it was later on. And you saw this in the increasing tendency towards direct criticism of other parties in NPT meetings and the use of rights of reply to respond to those criticisms. When I started in the business, that didn't happen, and now it's become an expected thing. This time around, there was not a day that passed in the first week and a half, it was 7 days, when there wasn't a right of reply. I would hope that states could maybe rethink their approach to criticizing one another in this forum and maybe focusing on their common interests. But it's hard when there are states that subordinate their interests in the regime to their other aims, like in particular Russia's war aims in Ukraine.
Yeah. Dr. Rauf, just to sort of, and this is the final sort of comment before I close this program. This is akin to a marriage going bad. If I'm reminded of Albie's Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, where Martha and George cannot even have conjugal relations without abusing each other. So the point really is that while things are going smoothly, these multilateral conferences will also largely go smoothly. And that is where my point comes in, which I'm consistently trying to make through this program, that in addition to what happens in those rooms and in that hall, there are other things that are happening, and context is important. And the marriage has really gone bad. No one is talking to the other. Everyone, which is why I use the word wolf world in my opening. So once you enter the wolf world, you're moving away from the Lockean cooperative paradigm into a very Hobbesian kind of system. And on the basis of that, and you have the final word, I want you to give me an assessment of where you think the treaty stands. How likely is it that it will slowly unravel? Not in and of itself in terms of something that inheres in it, but on the basis of pressures from outside. And whether there is any hope that things could be revived and states could start talking to each other once again.
Well, I think the problem emanates from the nuclear five. When they're more or less on the same page, the NPT review process works reasonably well. But when they're quarreling with each other, that affects, they both have their respective allied systems. So the biggest group other than the non-aligned, which is 110, are the Western countries aligned with the US as part of defense arrangements underpinned by nuclear weapons. These are members of NATO, Australia, South Korea, and Japan. And more, they are now having a unified voice on divisive issues such as Russia and Ukraine, China's nuclear weapon buildup, and so on. And so once they are disunited and this alliance system kicks in, so in the NPT now we have repetitive statements by a whole bunch of NATO countries popping up justifying NATO nuclear sharing. Originally they said it was grandfathered. Now they have a new talking point that NATO nuclear sharing is a non-proliferation good. It's because of it that so many countries didn't develop nuclear weapons, and NPT states parties should be thankful for this. We haven't used the term friendly proliferation as yet, but this is something what you referred to in your introductory comments. The Polish president openly called for nuclear weapons. The South Korean president, who's sitting in jail, called for nuclear weapons. There have been voices in Japan calling for nuclear weapons. Yeah. We worry about 440.9 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium in Iran. There are 8.4 metric tons of plutonium sitting in Japan, of course, under safeguards. That's 8,500 kilograms. For the IAEA, 8 kilograms of plutonium and 25 kilograms of highly enriched uranium are significant quantities for one nuclear weapon. But I wanted to come back to a number of points. So the NPT's origins, we can, first of all, controlling proliferation of nuclear weapons goes all the way back to 1945 and the different plans, Baruch Plan, Acheson-Lillian Plan, Gromyko Plan, the famous speech by President Eisenhower on the 8th of December in 1953, Atoms for Peace, that led to the IAEA. And incidentally, India, Pakistan, Israel, 23 other countries benefited from the US cooperation. And the research reactor that is not very far from where you are, Nellore, came from the US, fueled by highly enriched uranium at the time.
And so did Iran's research.
But then it came with the obligation to accept safeguards, and that's where the NPT came in, which really gave teeth to the IAEA safeguard system, which was struggling until the Non-Proliferation Treaty came in and made it an obligation for non-nuclear weapon states. And also the two nuclear weapon states scared themselves with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that led them in 1963 to prohibit nuclear testing in environments other than underground. And we have a whole bunch of other treaties, Outer Space Treaty, Celestial Bodies Treaty, Seabed Treaty, and so on. So this has been a continuous process of which the NPT, in one sense, was the culmination. And now, given the frustration of many of the non-nuclear weapon states, particularly those who are concerned and affected by the effects of nuclear weapons development, nuclear weapons testing, led to bringing up language from the preamble, the catastrophic consequences, so translated into humanitarian consequences, which eventually led to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was their way of expressing themselves that we are not completely satisfied with what the NPT is doing, so we are providing another pathway. And incidentally, what people don't recognize that we already have 5 regional treaties prohibiting nuclear weapons. Each nuclear weapon-free zone treaty's official name is Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, for example, in Central Asia. So what the TPNW does is it globalizes it. But the 5 weapon states and their allies are adamantly opposed to it, and a lot of hot air was expelled at the review conference on this one as well. You talked about the countries outside the NPT. So India and Pakistan are still obligated under Security Council Resolution of 1172 not to have developed further nuclear weapons, ceased ballistic missile development, but everyone's forgotten that. And then in 2005, we had the cardinal sin of the Bush administration opening up nuclear cooperation with India, and then forced the way through in 2008 with the Nuclear Suppliers Group giving an exception.
Lots of other countries jumped on that bandwagon.
Yeah, and the price for that was that Brazil had then said, okay, their verification agreement with the Argentine-Brazilian Agency for Accounting and Control is equivalent to the additional protocol. So the very countries that were promoting universality of the additional protocol to IAEA safeguards agreements, which came about as a result to comment that Mark made, the lessons from 1991 and the discovery of Iraq's undeclared nuclear weapon development program. We drove a truck through that. So we ourselves are destroying the system that we purport to defend. And the 5 weapon states did hold a meeting in Cairo and a meeting in Casablanca before the review conference, where they could not even agree to issue a statement that they met. And the meeting, I'm told, in New York was basically to agree on what to strip from the president's various drafts, which resulted in the final version 5. I also want to take exception to, I'm sorry for that, Ejaz, this concept of entanglement. I prefer the term intermingling. Entanglement is not something deliberate. Intermixing is. So we are now blurring the differences between advanced conventional weapons and low-yield nuclear weapons. And then when you add artificial intelligence and targeting platforms like Maven from Palantir and so on, it's not the intermingling. It's intermingling. It's not entanglement as such. So this is also very destabilizing. When it comes to AI, this is not the first time that we have destabilizing technologies coming on the table. We shouldn't forget that, we had going from single warhead to multiple independent re-entry vehicles, MIRV missiles. We had anti-satellite weapon developments. We had precision-guided munitions. We had Star Wars. Then we have Golden Dome. So these were all destructive, destabilizing technologies. And in March of 2024, here in Vienna, at the Hofburg Palace, the Austrians held a conference on destabilizing technologies and AI. And every one of the technology holders, US, Russia, China, and others, opposed any limits. They used the argument used by the gun lobby in the US, AI and these systems don't kill people, people kill people. So we don't really need any guardrails. With regard to nuclear testing, a couple of years ago, I suggested to the executive secretary of the CTBTO to look into what we call TCBMs, transparency and confidence building measures, to address the point that Mark Goodman made and the current allegations of the United States that Russia is carrying out very small, low-yield tests below 300 kilotons, which is below the detection capability of the international monitoring system of the CTBTO. And we have to give credit to the US and the National Nuclear Security Administration, because they have undertaken transparency visits to the national test site in Nevada. They've taken some NGOs, and they provided a lot of information, which you can find on the website. And that's a good model for the other nuclear weapon states to also emulate. And then, we have gradual loss of civility in the NPT process. In the past, Russians and Americans and Chinese would argue, and then they would go have a coffee outside and talk civilly. They would talk about their children, about their family, going for a walk in the woods. It doesn't happen anymore. Now we have personal hatreds.
Yeah.
When people see me talking to certain delegations, they come up with and say, "You were talking to such and so." I said, "Yeah, so what? They're a member of the IAEA. You have to talk to your adversaries. You have to talk to the people you don't agree with to come to an agreement to resolve issues." So this ostracization started with the Ukraine issue, and particularly after the Russian invasion and the Biden administration refusing to talk to Russia until the strategic defeat of Russia had been achieved in Ukraine, and the Russians have latched on to that as well. So we also need to look at ourselves. And finally, non-nuclear weapon states also have some burden to bear in wrecking the review process, which I alluded to early. So we shouldn't blame only the 5 nuclear weapon states. I think a collectivity. So we also have a new issue which we didn't discuss and we don't have time, and that is naval nuclear propulsion. So first it was Australia out of the gate, then Brazil came out in March of 2022, and October, November, South Korea got the go-ahead to also develop nuclear power. This has an important impact because the nuclear material will be outside of safeguards because of a loophole built into the system at the insistence of Italy, Germany, and others at the time the NPT was negotiated, and the safeguards agreement was negotiated in 1970. So that's a big mouthful here. Finally, even the countries outside the things are still subscribing. Pakistan has been falling over backwards trying to get membership into the NSG. They have strengthened their export controls every other day. They send a letter to the IAEA to publish a new information circular showing how Pakistan has updated its export controls in the nuclear, chemical, and other areas. So even the countries outside the regime find it useful to subscribe to some elements of the regime.
Yeah.
And I sort of find some perverse delight in India and Pakistan whenever an NPT review conference fails. Aha, PT is failing. We told you so. So why don't you fix the system? Why don't you bring us in and recognize us as nuclear weapon states? That's not going to happen because that's breaking faith with the 186 non-nuclear weapon states parties who joined this treaty. So we eventually want a world without nuclear weapons, not a country with more quote-unquote recognized nuclear weapons.
You know, context is certainly important, and that's something which reminds me of the Great War in Heavens that Milton talked about, and where after these rebel angels have suffered the defeat and they get together, and Nisroch stands there and he talks about those great lines: perhaps more valid arms, weapons more violent when next we meet, may serve to better us and worse our foes. So this is what is happening now in the wolf world. When things become inimical, then obviously basic decencies and courtesies are defenestrated, and we think about getting that one weapon that Nisroch talked about that's likely to worse our enemies. But thank you so much, Doctors Porter, Goodman, Rauf. This is all for this episode. If you like this discussion, do send us comments. It helps us improve the program. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.